What does a hero look like? Does a Nobel laureate wear a crown? For TSA agents Rick Jennings and Brenda Davies at New York's JFK International Airport. A hero certainly didn't look like Dr. Kaelen and Dr. Imani Vance. In their simple hand-woven clothes, the couple looked like targets for a power trip, an easy laugh on a boring Tuesday morning. The agents mocked their attire, tore through their luggage with performative suspicion, and dismissed them with a sneer. They had no idea their victims were just hours away from receiving the highest honor in science. They had no idea they had just humiliated the future, and that the entire world was about to watch them pay for it. The air in JFK's Terminal 4 hummed with a familiar, anxious energy, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the palpable stress of thousands of intersecting journeys. For Dr. Kaelen and Dr. Imani Vance, the sterile, recycled air was thick with something else anticipation. They were on the precipice of the most significant moment of their professional lives. In less than 24 hours in Stockholm, Sweden, they would stand before the King Carl XVI Gustav and accept the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for their revolutionary work in cellular regeneration. Yet to the world, they were just two more travelers in the serpentine queue for security screening. They were intentionally understated. Immani wore a beautiful, loose-fitting bubu, its deep indigo fabric, covered in a subtle, intricate pattern hand-dyed by artisans in a Nigerian village that had played a small but crucial role in their research. Kaelen wore a matching agbada, simpler in its design, comfortable for the long flight ahead. The clothes were a quiet homage, a personal nod to the continent that had inspired their early work. To them, the garments were imbued with meaning and respect. To TSA officer Rick Jennings, they were a joke. Jennings had the weary, entitled look of a man who'd been in a position of minor authority for too long. His eyes, small and perpetually squinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, scanned the approaching couple with a familiar blend of boredom and disdain. He nudged his partner, Officer Brenda Davies, a woman whose sour expression seemed permanently etched onto her face. "Get a load of these two." Jennings muttered his voice, a low, gravelly sneer, meant only for Davies, but loud enough for the Vances now just a few feet away to hear. "Coming to you live from the set of a low-budget Wakanda." Davies let out a short, sharp snort of a laugh. "You think they've even got the passports? Probably think they can just drum their way onto the plane." Kaelen's hand instinctively found Imani's. He felt her fingers tighten around his, a small, silent signal of shared endurance. They had faced far worse than this. They had battled institutional racism in academia, fought for funding from skeptical boards, and navigated the treacherous waters of scientific rivalry. The petty insults of two airport security agents were gnats to be swatted away. Still, it stung. It was the casual, unthinking cruelty of it that always did. Next, Jennings barked, waving them forward with an impatient flick of his wrist. Kaelen placed his carry-on bag, a worn leather satchel containing his laptop, and a lifetime of research notes onto the conveyor belt. Immani did the same with her tote. They walked through the metal detector without a beep. But it was never going to be that simple. "So, ma'am, we're going to need to do a secondary screening," Jennings announced, his voice now laced with a formal, almost gleeful authority. He pulled their bags from the belt before they could reach them. Davies stepped forward, snapping on a pair of blue latex gloves with an unnerving crackle. "Is there a problem, officer?" Kaelen asked, his tone measured and calm, a carefully constructed dam against the flood of anger rising within him. "That's what we're here to find out, aren't we?" Jennings said, gesturing to a sterile steel table off to the side. "Welcome to the random search. Lucky you." The randomness felt pointed surgical. No one else was being pulled aside. Not the businessman in the wrinkled suit, not the giggling college students in their sweats, not the family with 3 screaming children. Just them. Davies unzipped Imani's tote bag with a rough tug. She pulled out a small beaded pouch. "What's this?" "It's a gift," Immani replied, her voice soft but firm. "From a village elder in Nigeria." Davies opened it and tipped the contents onto the cold metal table, a collection of smooth grey stones and dried herbs. She poked at them with a gloved finger. "Herbs? What kind of voodoo nonsense is this?" "They are for good fortune," Immani said the words, catching in her throat. The herbs were from the community's spiritual leader, a blessing for their journey. Seeing them scattered and prodded like contraband felt like a desecration. Jennings, meanwhile, had turned his attention to Kalen's satchel. He pulled out the laptop, handling it with a careless aggression that made Kalin flinch. Then came the notebooks. They were filled with dense equations, complex molecular diagrams, and handwritten observations, the raw, unfiltered genesis of their Nobel-winning work. "What's all this chicken scratch?" Jennings asked, flipping through a notebook with a thumb stained with what looked like mustard. "Looks like you're trying to design a bomb or something." "That's my life's work," Kaelen said, the dam of his composure beginning to crack. "It's cellular biology. It is for a medical conference." He chose not to say the medical conference. To invite more scrutiny, more mockery, felt unbearable. "Uh-huh. Cellular biology." Jennings mocked the phrase, drawing it out with exaggerated slowness. He held up a page for Davies to see. "You make any sense of this, Brenda, looks like gibberish to me. They're probably just smuggling something." Davies replied, now rummaging through Imani's clothes, holding up a delicate scarf and inspecting it as if it were hiding a weapon. "People like them are always trying to pull a fast one." The phrase hung in the air, thick and suffocating. People like them. Other travelers were now slowing down their curiosity, piqued by the unfolding drama. A few stared with open pity, others with a nervous impatience, but most just looked away, eager to escape the orbit of the confrontation. Their silence was its own form of complicity, another layer of the humiliation. Kaelen looked at his wife. He saw the fire in her eyes, the proud set of her jaw. Imani was a descendant of Yoruba queens, a woman of formidable intellect and even more formidable will. She would not be broken by this. And seeing her strength, Kaelen found his own. Officer Kaelen said, his voice dropping into a lower, more serious register that seemed to cut through the terminal's noise. "You are inspecting our personal belongings. You have found nothing. We have complied with all of your instructions. We have a flight to catch." Jennings seemed to enjoy the shift in Kalen's tone. It was a challenge. He leaned in close, his voice a conspiratorial whisper that reeked of stale coffee and self-satisfaction. "You'll catch your flight when we say you can catch your flight. See, we're the ones in charge here. Not you. Not in your fancy dress-up clothes." He flicked the sleeve of Kalen's agbada with a dismissive finger. "This isn't some jungle, chief. This is America. We have rules." With a final theatrical sigh of exasperation, Jennings slammed the notebook shut and shoved it back into the satchel, bending several pages in the process. Davies, having found nothing, aggressively stuffed Imani's belongings back into her tote, zipping it with a flourish of finality. "All right, you're clear," Jennings grunted, pushing their bags toward them. Have a nice flight, wherever it is you're going." They gathered their violated belongings, the scattered herbs and bent pages, a testament to the encounter. They did not look back. They walked away, a silent, regal procession of two, leaving the smirking officers behind them. The gazes of the other passengers felt like a physical weight on their backs. As they walked toward their gate, the humiliation began to cool, hardening into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They hadn't just been insulted. A line had been crossed, and somehow, some way, there would be an accounting. They just didn't know it would be the entire world that would bear witness to it. The pressurized cabin of Scandinavian Airlines Flight 904 was a world away from the raw hostility of the TSA checkpoint. Here the lighting was soft, the seats were a calming shade of Nordic blue, and the gentle hum of the Rolls-Royce engines was a lullaby of escape. Kaelen and Immani settled into their business-class seats, the spacious pods offering a welcome cocoon of privacy. For the first 30 minutes, as the Boeing 707 taxied took off and climbed through the clouds into the vast, sun-drenched expanse above the Atlantic, they did not speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, laden with the unspoken things that had just transpired. It was a silence they had shared before after a grant rejection letter filled with thinly veiled condescension, or after a colleague had patronizingly explained their own research back to them. It was the silence of shared exhaustion, of being perpetually required to be twice as good, twice as composed, just to be seen as equal. Immani finally broke it. She reached across the console that separated them and laid her hand on Kalen's arm. Her touch was an anchor. "Are you all right, my love?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. Kaelen stared out the window at the endless carpet of white clouds, his reflection a faint, troubled ghost on the plexiglass. He exhaled slowly, a breath he felt he'd been holding since he first saw the sneer on Officer Jennings's face. "I'm angry, Immani," he admitted, turning to face her. The calmness he had projected at the gate was gone, replaced by a deep, simmering rage. "I'm angry that in 2025, after everything we've achieved, everything we represent, we can be reduced to that, to a caricature. Voodoo nonsense. Jungle clothes." He spat the words out as if they were poison. He bent the pages of my notebook, Immani, the one with the initial equations for the cytokine sequencing. He touched it with his grubby, mustard-stained fingers. It was such a small detail, but it was a violation of the sacred. That notebook was more than paper and ink. It was a physical manifestation of their shared genius, the cradle of their discovery. Imani's expression was a mixture of empathy and her own fierce indignation. "I know, Kaelen. I saw. I wanted to. I don't know what I wanted to do. Scream. Lecture them on the intricate socio-cultural significance of a dire fabric. What would have been the point? You can't reason with that kind of ignorance. It's a fortress with no doors." She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. A memory surfaced unbidden. She was a young girl, maybe 10 years old, in a department store with her mother. She had picked up a beautiful porcelain doll, admiring its dress. The store manager had rushed over, snatched the doll from her hands, and said, "That's not for you to touch." Her mother, a formidable woman who was a history professor, had calmly but icily proceeded to educate the manager on the history of commerce and the buying power of her community, until he was stammering apologies. Her mother had fought back with words. Immani had chosen science. She believed that her work, her contributions, would be her shield and her statement. She believed that achieving something as monumental as a Nobel Prize would finally elevate them beyond the reach of such petty, demeaning prejudice. She had been wrong. I think she said, opening her eyes, the part that hurts the most is the disappointment. I truly believed. I hoped that this trip would be different, that for these few days we would be celebrated not as black scientists, but just as scientists, that the name Nobel laureate would be a shield. But we hadn't even left American soil before we were reminded that to some people all we'll ever be is what they see first. A flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Anja with a warm Swedish accent, approached their seats. Dr. and Dr. Vance. Can I get you something to drink before our meal service? Some champagne, perhaps? To celebrate. Her smile was genuine, her tone respectful. She had clearly been briefed on who her passengers were. The contrast was jarring, a sudden shift in altitude from the gutter to the stars. Thank you, Anja, Kaelen said, forcing a smile. That's very kind. We'd love some. As Anja bustled away, the simple act of being recognized, of being treated with the dignity they deserved, almost made it worse. It highlighted the chasm between the world they were flying toward and the one they had just left behind. Kalin pulled his satchel onto his lap and carefully opened it. He took out the offended notebook and gently tried to smooth the creased pages. He paused, his finger tracing one of the bent corners. Do you remember that first year in the lab at Johns Hopkins? He asked, a nostalgic sadness in his voice. We had that tiny little office in the basement. No windows. The equipment was all second-hand. Professor Albright told us our research proposal was overly ambitious. Imani smiled, a real smile this time. I remember, and I remember what you said. You said, good, ambitious is the only thing worth being. She touched the notebook. We were so hungry then. Hungry to prove him wrong, to prove everyone wrong. We did, Kaelen said softly. We did. We created a therapy that can make damaged nerve cells regenerate. We've given hope to people with spinal cord injuries, with Alzheimer's, with MS. We've done something that will outlive us by centuries. And yet Immani finished his thought. A man whose only qualification is a uniform can make us feel like we are nothing. They sipped their champagne in a renewed silence. The bubbles fizzed on their tongues, a taste of celebration that felt unearned, premature. The joy of Stockholm, of the ceremony of the recognition, was still there, waiting for them across the ocean. But the encounter at the security gate had cast a long, dark shadow over it. It was a stark, painful reminder that no amount of achievement could fully insulate them from the pervasive, irrational poison of prejudice. The journey to accept their prize had begun not with honor, but with a deep and wounding humiliation, a weight that would travel with them all the way to the gilded halls of the Nobel Foundation. And a tiny, persistent thought lodged itself in Kalen's mind. This couldn't be the end of it. The injustice was too raw, too blatant to simply dissipate into the stratosphere. The arrival in Stockholm was like stepping through a portal into another reality. As soon as they deplaned at Arlanda Airport, they were met on the jet bridge by a small, dignified delegation. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a warm smile introduced herself as Dr. Astrid Lindgren, a member of the Nobel Committee for Physiology or Medicine. Beside her stood a young man from the Swedish Foreign Ministry, tasked with being their liaison. Dr. Vance, Dr. Lindgren, said, her handshake firm and her gaze direct. Welcome to Stockholm. On behalf of the Nobel Foundation and the Karolinska Institute, we are so profoundly honored to have you here. Your work, it is magnificent." There was no talk of their clothes, no suspicious glances. There was only a deep, palpable respect for their minds, for their contribution to humanity. Kaelen and Immani exchanged a look. The warmth of the welcome was a soothing balm on the fresh wound of their departure from New York. The days leading up to the ceremony were a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated events. They were chauffeured in a private Volvo through the pristine, beautiful streets of Stockholm, a city that seemed to glitter under the crisp December sky. They stayed in a lavish suite at the Grand Hotel, with a breathtaking view of the Royal Palace and the Riddarfjärden Bay. They attended receptions, press conferences, and intimate dinners with the other laureates, a brilliant physicist who had confirmed the existence of a new subatomic particle, and a sharp-witted economist whose theories on poverty were reshaping global policy. In this rarefied air of intellectual camaraderie, the incident at JFK began to feel distant, almost surreal. They were surrounded by people who understood the language of science, of discovery, of relentless dedication. They spoke of cytokine storms and protein folding with the same passion others might reserve for sports or politics. For fleeting, beautiful moments they forgot. But the memory lingered a ghost at the feast. It would surface at odd times. During a tour of the Nobel Museum, Immani saw an exhibit on Marie Curie and the sexism she faced. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of kinship, a reminder that the path for pioneers is never smooth. Kaelen, while dressing for a formal dinner, found the agbada he had worn on the flight. He ran his hand over the fabric, and the image of Officer Jennings' dismissive flick of the wrist flashed in his mind, souring his mood for hours. The true intrusion came from a small, seemingly insignificant detail. While unpacking completely, Immani realized that the small beaded pouch from the Nigerian elder was damaged. The leather drawstring had been snapped likely when Officer Davies had aggressively tugged it open. A few of the tiny beads had come loose and were lost. Immani held the damaged pouch in her hand, her heart sinking. It was a small thing, a trinket, but its significance was immense. It was a symbol of connection, of a community's blessing. Seeing it broken felt like a violation all over again, a tangible piece of evidence of the disrespect they had endured. "He broke it," she said softly, showing Kaelen. "That woman. She broke it." Kaelen took the pouch, his jaw tightening. The entire ugly scene came rushing back. The sneers, the invasive hands, the public humiliation. The carefully constructed peace of Stockholm shattered. Meanwhile, 8,000 kilometers away in Brooklyn, a storm was beginning to gather. Her name was Maya Rodriguez. She was a 24-year-old freelance journalist and activist flying to Berlin for a conference on digital rights. She had been standing 2 people behind the Vances in the security line at JFK. She had seen everything. She had seen the officers' smirks, heard their comments about Wakanda, watched them tear through the couple's belongings with a contempt that made her stomach clench. Maya had been shaken by it. She had wanted to say something to intervene, but the fear of being targeted herself, of missing her international flight, of being put on some list, had kept her silent. Her silence had gnawed at her for the entire flight. Once in her Berlin hotel room, she couldn't shake the image of the dignified couple walking away, their shoulders straight, their pride a shield against the ugliness they had just faced. She was a journalist. Silence was not her trade. She opened her laptop and began to write. She didn't know the couple's names. She didn't know where they were going. But she described them in detail, the woman's stunning indigo boubou, the man's quiet authority. And she described the TSA agents, Jennings and Davies, in even greater detail, quoting their cruel words verbatim. She wrote with a controlled fury, channeling her outrage into a sharp, incisive post for a popular progressive online magazine. The article titled, "I watched the TSA casually dehumanize a couple at JFK and I did nothing," went live at 3:00 a.m. New York time. At first it was a ripple, a few hundred shares from her followers, but her story was vivid and damning. It was the kind of everyday injustice that so many people had witnessed or experienced themselves. By sunrise on the East Coast, the ripple was becoming a wave. The hashtag #JFK Justice started trending on Twitter. People shared their own stories of TSA misconduct. The post was picked up by larger news outlets, then by television commentators. The story had a crucial element of mystery. Who was this elegant, unknown couple? Where were they going? The public's imagination was captured. They were anonymous avatars of grace under fire. Back in Stockholm, the Vances remained blissfully unaware. They were at the Nobel Concert Hall, listening to a breathtaking performance by the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra. The music washed over them, a soaring, beautiful escape. But on his phone, the Vances' young liaison from the Foreign Ministry. Henrik saw a notification from a US news aggregator. The headline was stark, viral outrage after eyewitness details. TSA harassment of mystery couple at JFK. He clicked the link and read Maya's article. His eyes widened as he read the description of the couple's clothing. He looked from his phone to the stage box, where the Vances were seated, listening intently to the music. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The mystery couple wasn't a mystery to him. They were sitting 20 feet away, and they were about to become the center of a global firestorm. The quiet dignity of their journey was over. The world was about to knock very loudly on their door. The day of the Nobel Prize award ceremony was a spectacle of solemn grandeur. The Stockholm Concert Hall, a masterpiece of Swedish neoclassicism, was filled to capacity with royalty dignitaries and the intellectual elite of the world. The air itself seemed to vibrate with history and importance. For Kaelen and Imani Vance, the day had begun in a state of shock. Henrik, their liaison, had approached them at breakfast, his face pale and serious. He showed them Maya Rodriguez's article, which was now the #1 trending story on the planet. They read it in stunned silence. Seeing the humiliation they had endured, laid bare for the world to see, was a deeply unsettling experience. It was validating, yes, but also re-traumatizing. Their private pan was now public property. Their phones, which they had kept on airplane mode to focus on the week's events, were now inundated with messages from friends, family, and colleagues who had connected the dots. The mystery was solved. The anonymous couple from JFK now had names Dr. Kaelen and Dr. Imani Vance, Nobel Prize, laureates-elect. The story had taken on a life of its own. The narrative was irresistible. Brilliant scientists on their way to receive humanity's highest honor are subjected to ignorant racist abuse by their own government's agents. It was a parable for the times. The Foundation will issue a statement of support. Of course, Henrik assured them. We will shield you from the media as much as possible. We are so terribly sorry that this has intruded upon your week. Immani looked at Kaelen. The anger from the flight had returned, but it was different now. It was sharper, more focused. It was no longer just their personal injury. It was a cause. They had been given a platform they had never asked for, but it was a platform nonetheless. "Thank you, Henrik," Imani said, her voice clear and steady. "We appreciate that, but I don't think we wish to be shielded." That afternoon, as they dressed for the ceremony, a profound sense of purpose settled over them. Imani chose a gown of deep sapphire velvet, elegant and regal. Kalin was fitted in the traditional white tie and tails. As they looked at their reflections in the mirror, they were no longer just scientists. They were symbols. The ceremony was as magnificent as promised. They walked in procession with the other laureates, took their seats on the stage under the warm, bright lights, and listened as the citations for each prize were read. When the presenter from the Karolinska Institute began detailing their work, the years of painstaking research, the flashes of insight, the breakthrough that had fundamentally altered our understanding of the body's capacity to heal, Imani felt tears well in her eyes. This was the truth of who they were. This was their story. Then came the moment. Their names were called. They rose, walked to the center of the stage, and bowed first to the King Carl XVI, Gustav, who presented them with their gold medals and diplomas, and then to the applauding audience. The standing ovation was thunderous, a wave of pure admiration and respect that washed over them, cleansing the lingering stain of the airport encounter. Tradition dictated that one of the laureates offered a brief response on behalf of all the winners. The honor had been given to the Vances. Kalin had prepared a thoughtful, eloquent speech about the power of collaboration, the importance of basic research, and their gratitude to their families and mentors. It was a perfect, safe speech. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the King of Sweden fellow scientists, his family watching via broadcast. He saw the weight of the moment. He took a deep breath, and then he glanced at Imani, who gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. In that instant, they made a silent agreement. The prepared speech was no longer enough. Kalin began as planned, thanking the Nobel Foundation and their colleagues, but then he paused, letting the silence hang in the grand hall. The journey to this stage is for every laureate a long and arduous one, he said, his voice resonating with a new, powerful gravity. It is a journey of the mind, but the physical journey can also be instructive. Just a few days ago, as my wife and I traveled here from the United States, we had an experience that was clarifying. A subtle shift occurred in the audience. A quiet murmur rippled through the hall. They knew he was referring to the story that had captivated the world. We were reminded. Kalin continued, his eyes finding Imani's, that progress and prejudice can and often do coexist. A person can be deemed worthy of the highest honor in science, and yet in the same week be deemed suspicious, be dehumanized because of the texture of their hair or the clothes they choose to wear. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet intensity of his words held every person in the room captive. My wife, Dr. Vance, is the lead author of our work. Her genius is the engine that drove our discovery. She is a scientist of immeasurable brilliance. She is also a black woman who loves the vibrant, meaningful textiles of her ancestors. These two facts are not at odds with each other. They are threads of the same beautiful tapestry. He paused again, letting the words sink in. The true measure of a society is not how it treats its most celebrated members, but how it treats every member. Dignity is not a prize to be earned. It is a birthright, and the work of science, the work of art, the work of peace, the work that is celebrated on this stage today, is ultimately about one thing: holding that fundamental human dignity against the forces of ignorance that seek to diminish it. He did not mention the TSA. He did not name officers Jennings and Davies. He didn't have to. He had elevated their specific ugly incident into a universal, timeless message. He spoke not as a victim, but as a teacher, a Nobel laureate in every sense of the word. He concluded his remarks, and for a moment there was absolute silence. Then the applause began. It was different from the earlier ovation. It was deeper, more resonant. It was an acknowledgement not just of their science, but of their courage and their grace. The international news cameras broadcasting live zoomed in on Kaelin's and Imani's faces. In newsrooms from New York to London to Lagos, editors scrambled. The story was no longer just about harassment. It was about a powerful, globally televised rebuke of prejudice from one of the world's most prestigious stages. Back in Queens, New York, Rick Jennings was watching the news on a beat-up television in his dimly lit living room, a half-eaten plate of microwaved lasagna on the table in front of him. He saw the man he had called Chief standing in a tuxedo, being honored by a king. He heard his words, and a cold, sickening dread, far worse than any supervisor's reprimand, began to creep into his heart. His small act of casual cruelty was no longer small. It was now a global incident, and he and Brenda Davies were standing directly at its epicenter. The reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability hurtling toward them at the speed of light. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By the time the Nobel banquet had concluded with its traditional candlelit procession, the Transportation Security Administration's Public Relations Department was in a full-blown 5-alarm fire. Their social media accounts were a raging torrent of outrage. The clip of Dr. Kalin Vance's speech was everywhere juxtaposed with Maya Rodriguez's visceral descriptions of the harassment. The hashtag #TSA humiliation was trending globally, eclipsing JFK justice. At the TSA's New York regional headquarters, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. The regional director, Marcus Thorne, was a man who had built his career on managing perceptions and burying problems. He was a creature of the bureaucracy skilled in the art of the carefully worded non-apology and the strategic internal review. He saw this not as a human rights issue, but as a communications crisis. The first step was to contain it. "Get me Jennings and Davies," he barked at his assistant. "Conference room, now." Rick Jennings and Brenda Davies arrived looking like they were facing a firing squad. The bravado they wore like a uniform at their checkpoint was gone, replaced by a pasty, fearful pallor. Jennings' usual sneer was a quivering line of anxiety. Davies' sour expression had curdled into outright terror. They had seen the news. They had seen their own insignificance thrown into stark relief against the Vances' global importance. Thorne's office had already identified them from airport surveillance footage and checkpoint logs within hours of the story breaking. The evidence was irrefutable. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Thorne began, his voice dangerously low. He didn't wait for an answer. "You two with your little power trip have made this agency the laughingstock of the world. You haven't just harassed a passenger. You've harassed a Nobel laureate. You've given every single one of our critics enough ammunition to last them a decade." The Secretary of Homeland Security called my personal cell phone this morning. The Secretary. "Sir, with all due respect," Jennings stammered, his voice cracking. It was a random search. The subjects, the passengers, they looked suspicious. Thorne slammed his hand down on the polished mahogany table, making both officers jump. Suspicious, he roared, his facade of control slipping. Suspicious of what? of carrying knowledge that could change the world, of wearing clothes that aren't from a department store. You weren't conducting a security screening. You were being bullies. You were being ignorant. And you were caught. Davies, who had been silent, finally spoke her voice, defensive. They were mouthy, especially the man. He had an attitude. He's a Nobel Prize winner. Thorne shot back, incredulous. He has a right to an attitude. You have a right to do your job professionally and respectfully, which you spectacularly failed to do. Thorne took a deep breath, smoothing his tie. The yelling was performative. Now came the strategy. Here's what's going to happen. The agency is releasing a statement. We are aware of the incident, and we are launching a full and thorough investigation. You two are on administrative leave, effective immediately. Paid for now. You will not speak to the press. You will not post on social media. You will not speak to anyone about this. Do you understand? They nodded numbly. Now tell me exactly what happened. And don't lie to me. Your careers are hanging by a thread, and I'm the one holding the scissors. What followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic damage control. The full and thorough investigation Thorne initiated was designed from the outset to be a sham. The goal wasn't to find the truth. It was to create a plausible narrative that would protect the institution. Thorne's strategy was to isolate the incident to frame Jennings and Davies as two regrettable outliers, a couple of bad apples, whose actions did not reflect the values of the TSA. The first step was to interview other TSA personnel who were on duty. The questions were leading, designed to elicit responses that downplayed the event. Did you perceive the secondary screening of passengers? Kaelen and Imani Vance to be unusually long or aggressive. Officer Jennings and Davies have a clean record. Wouldn't you agree? The younger officers, intimidated and wanting to protect their jobs, gave vague, non-committal answers. The union representative advised Jennings and Davies to stick to the suspicious behavior narrative, claiming the Vances were non-compliant and argumentative, a classic case of blaming the victim. Thorne's team drafted an internal report that was a work of fiction. It acknowledged that professional standards may not have been met, but carefully omitted the racist and demeaning language reported by Maya Rodriguez. It painted a picture of a misunderstanding, a routine screening that escalated due to the passengers' agitation. It was a document designed to be leaked to muddy the waters and create doubt. But Thorne and the TSA underestimated two things: the power of a righteous global public and the integrity of a few individuals within their own system. A senior TSA training officer at JFK, a man named David Chen, who had worked for the agency for 15 years, was disgusted. He had been quietly raising concerns about Jennings and Davies' behavior for years. He had filed multiple informal complaints about their aggressive attitudes, their tendency to profile, and their use of derogatory language. His complaints had always been buried by middle management, dismissed as interpersonal conflicts. Chen had seen the Vances that day. He had been overseeing a different checkpoint, but had noticed the confrontation. He'd seen the couple's dignity and Jennings' smug contempt. When he read the draft of Thorne's internal report, which he knew to be a whitewash, something inside him snapped. He had spent his career trying to instill professionalism and respect in new recruits. This investigation made a mockery of everything he believed in. That night, David Chen went home and logged onto his computer. He had copies of his previous complaints. He had training manuals that explicitly forbade the kind of behavior Jennings and Davies had exhibited. And he had a friend who worked for a major national newspaper. He typed out an email with the subject line, "The Truth About the TSA," and the Nobel laureates. The storm that Marcus Thorne thought he could manage was about to become a hurricane. The sham investigation was about to be blown wide open, and the consequences would be far more severe than just the termination of 2 rogue officers. The institutional rot was about to be exposed to the world. The hard karma, when it came for Rick Jennings and Brenda Davies, did not arrive like a sudden lightning strike. It was more like a rising tide of sewage seeping into every crack and crevice of their lives until they were completely submerged. The first wave was David Chen's leak. The story published on the front page of the New York Times was a bombshell. TSA whistleblower, JFK harassment, part of a pattern, supervisors buried complaints. Chen, speaking on the record, provided documented evidence of at least 4 prior official complaints against Jennings and Davies for similar profiling incidents involving minority travelers. He detailed how the system under Marcus Thorne's leadership was designed to protect problem officers rather than address their behavior. Thorne's carefully constructed bad apple narrative was obliterated. Now the barrel itself was proven to be rotten. The public and political pressure became unbearable. A congressional committee announced an immediate investigation into TSA practices, specifically calling for Marcus Thorne to testify. The Secretary of Homeland Security, facing a full-blown scandal, had no choice but to act decisively. The professional karma was swift and brutal. Rick Jennings and Brenda Davies were fired. Not just placed on leave, terminated for cause. Their union, seeing the mountain of evidence and the political toxicity of the case, offered only a token half-hearted defense before cutting them loose. Marcus Thorne was forced to resign in disgrace, his career in federal service over. But the true hard karma, the kind the universe seems to cook up with a special ironic relish, was only just beginning to unfold in their personal lives. Rick Jennings had always seen his TSA uniform as a source of power, and more importantly, a source of pride to hold over his ex-wife, who had left him for a successful dentist. He lived in a small mortgaged house in Howard Beach, Queens, and his life's ambition was to one day afford a boat, a symbol of success he could flaunt. He frequently posted pictures of himself in uniform on Facebook, projecting an image of a man on the front line of national security. Now that image was his ruin. His face was everywhere. News vans parked on his street. His neighbors who once offered a friendly wave now hurried inside their homes when they saw him. The local VFW post where he was a member quietly revoked his membership, citing conduct unbecoming. His son, a freshman in college, stopped returning his calls, ashamed to be associated with him. The ultimate twist came from a place he never expected. The very fabric he had mocked became his undoing. In the wake of the scandal, a textile expert from the Smithsonian was interviewed on a major news network. She was shown a photo of Dr. Imani Vance in her boo-boo. The expert identified the intricate pattern as a rare form of attire à la beurre, a resist-dyeing technique practiced by a single small community of Yoruba artisans in Ogun State, Nigeria. She explained that this specific pattern was reserved for honored guests and was believed to hold protective qualities. It was, she said, a wearable piece of art, steeped in history and reverence. The news segment went viral. The mockery of the jungle clothes was now exposed not just as racist, but as an act of profound cultural desecration. For Rick, this had a very practical consequence. He had a side business, a small online store, where he sold what he claimed were military-grade survival gear and tactical equipment. His customer base was a community that fetishized strength, patriotism, and honor. When his identity as the infamous TSA agent became widely known, His customers abandoned him in droves, flooding his site's reviews with comments calling him a disgrace and a bully who targeted innocent people. His business, his only other source of income and pride, evaporated in less than a week. He was left with nothing but his notoriety and a garage full of unsold tactical sporks. For Brenda Davies, the karma was even more intimately cruel. She lived a quiet life in a small apartment in Flatbush, caring for her elderly mother, who suffered from a severe neurological disorder. Her mother was her whole world. The extra overtime Brenda often worked was to pay for the expensive medications and specialized care her mother required. Brenda's defining characteristic was a deep-seated resentment. She felt the world had dealt her a bad hand, and she took it out on travelers who she perceived as having it easier than her. She saw the Vances' clothes not just as foreign, but as extravagant a sign of a carefree life she could never have. It was a bitter, ugly envy. Her mother's primary source of joy was watching television, especially the international news. When the story broke, Brenda tried to shield her from it, but it was impossible. One afternoon, her mother was watching a replay of the Nobel ceremony. She saw Dr. Kalin Vance's speech. Then the news report cut to a picture of the two disgraced TSA agents. Her mother looked at the screen, then at her daughter. Her mind, though clouded by her illness, made the connection. "Brenda," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That man, the doctor, he helps people like me." The Vances' research into cellular regeneration was directly related to the field of neurodegenerative diseases. While not a direct cure for her mother's specific ailment, it represented the very science that offered her, and millions like her, their only sliver of hope. The realization shattered what was left of Brenda's world. The people she had belittled, the work she had indirectly mocked by defiling their notes, was the very work that might one day have saved her mother. Her act of petty cruelty was a betrayal of the one person she loved. Her mother's health took a sharp decline after that, the stress and disappointment proving too much. The overtime pay was gone, and the weight of her guilt was a new debilitating illness. The hard karma for Brenda wasn't public shame. It was a private, soul-crushing agony, a daily reminder that her own hate had struck a blow against her own hope. The world had moved on to the next scandal, but for Rick Jennings and Brenda Davies, the consequences were permanent. They were no longer anonymous figures in a bureaucracy. They were footnotes in the story of a Nobel Prize, their names forever linked with ignorance and hate, living out their quiet karmic sentences in the ruins of the lives they had built. Weeks turned into months. The fury of the news cycle faded, as it always does, replaced by new headlines and new outrages. The congressional hearings on the TSA resulted in promises of sweeping reforms, new training modules on cultural sensitivity, and a stricter civilian oversight committee. Marcus Thorne's resignation was accepted, and David Chen, the whistleblower, was lauded as a hero and promoted to a position where he could implement meaningful change. But the final chapter of the story belonged not to the disgraced, but to the dignified. After the whirlwind of Stockholm and the ensuing media storm, Dr. Kaelen and Dr. Imani Vance returned home to Baltimore. They craved the quiet sanctuary of their laboratory and the familiar comfort of their home. The world wanted to keep them in the spotlight, to turn them into full-time activists, icons of the struggle against prejudice. They received invitations from talk shows, offers for book deals, and pleas to run for political office. They gracefully declined them all. They did, however, agree to one final extensive interview with a respected journalist. It would be their definitive statement on the matter, a way to close the door on the incident and reopen the door to their life's work. The interview took place not in a television studio, but in their bustling lab at Johns Hopkins. They sat surrounded by the tools of their trade centrifuges, microscopes, and complex imaging equipment. They wore their simple white lab coats attire that no one could misinterpret. The journalist asked the inevitable question. The agents who harassed you, Rick Jennings and Brenda Davies, have been fired. Their lives have been by all accounts ruined. Do you feel that justice has been served? Do you take any satisfaction in their downfall? Kalin looked at Imani, and she answered, her voice calm and thoughtful. What we feel is a profound sadness, she said. Choosing her words with the same precision she applied to her research. We never asked for them to be ruined. We asked for accountability. Their actions were a symptom of a deeper problem. To take personal satisfaction in their suffering would be to engage in the same smallness of spirit that victimized us. It solves nothing. Kalin continued the thought. Justice isn't about retribution. It's about restoration. It's about building a world where such an incident is less likely to happen again. That's where our focus is. And then they announced their plan. They were using a significant portion of their Nobel Prize money, nearly $500,000, to establish the Vance Foundation for Scientific and Social Dignity. The foundation had two primary missions. The first was to provide scholarships and mentorship programs for underprivileged students, particularly from minority communities who wanted to pursue careers in STEM. The next Nobel laureate, Kaelen explained, might be a young girl in the Bronx or a boy in rural Mississippi who just needs the resources and the belief of others to get started. The second mission was even more ambitious. The foundation would work with civil rights organizations to develop and fund advanced evidence-based cultural competency and de-escalation training programs. Their first partnership was with the Department of Homeland Security, aimed at reforming TSA training from the ground up. They were not just condemning the darkness, they were lighting a candle and handing it to their former tormentors. It was an act of radical grace, an alchemy that sought to transform the ugliness they had endured into a force for positive, systemic change. The final question from the journalist was about the damaged pouch and the creased notebook pages. What happened to those items? Imani smiled. The pouch sits on my desk. I never got it repaired. It's a reminder, not of the disrespect, but of the fact that things that are broken can still be beautiful and meaningful. And the notebook. Kaelen picked it up from a nearby table. It was open to one of the pages that Officer Jennings had bent. The crease was still visible. The notebook is fine, he said. The equations still work. The science is still true. The knowledge is unharmed. That's the thing about truth and knowledge. You can try to mock it, you can try to defile it. You can bend the pages on which it's written. But you can't ever truly damage it. It endures. The story of the Vances ended there, not with the karmic ruin of two hateful people, but with the quiet, unassailable triumph of two brilliant ones. They showed the world that the most powerful response to dehumanization is not to debase your enemy, but to elevate humanity itself. They returned to their work, to the elegant dance of molecules and cells, their dignity not just intact, but amplified, leaving a legacy far greater than a single prize. It was a legacy of science, of course, but also a masterclass in turning poison into medicine and injustice into a blueprint for a better world. The story of the Vances isn't just about the triumph of intellect, but the ultimate victory of grace. It's a stark reminder that a person's worth is not defined by their clothes, their accent, or the assumptions of those in uniform. The hard karma that found agents Jennings and Davies wasn't supernatural. It was the direct consequence of their own actions, amplified by the dignity of the very people they tried to diminish. They learned the hard way that you can't judge a book by its cover, especially when that book contains the secrets to changing the world. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and share it with others. Let's spread the message that prejudice has no place in our world. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas where justice in the end is always served. Click that notification bell so you never miss a story.